The Marie and Pierre Curie discovery of radium in 1898 made history. Today, radium is used in specific cases in the medical field like cancer radiography, although not too long after its discovery it was used in other ways, most notably in radium dials. These dials were coated with luminous paint that contained radium, hence the name. The public knew little about the danger that these held. Not only was it a danger for those who had the products in their home, but it was even more so a danger for the individuals who'd assembled them and painted them in the first place. Orange, New Jersey, 1917. Female factory workers were hired and used to paint these dials under the pretense that the paint was harmless. Later, they became known as the Radium Girls. At these jobs, they ingested fatal amounts of radium after directions to point their brushes with their lips to sharpen the tip. These directions came to fruition after corporate decided that it would save time and material not having to use rags or water to rinse the brushes. The United States Radium Corporation, or USRC, obtained and purified radium to make luminous paints from carnotite ore and then were sold under the moniker Undark. The company was a defense contractor for the USA and supplied the military with their radioluminescent watches. Over 300 workers who were mainly women were employed in Orange, New Jersey by the USRC. The owners and scientists were at least comfortably familiar with the effects of radium, but yet still set about 70 women to handle the radium in some way, shape, or form without proper precaution. For contrast, chemists used lead screens, tongs, and masks to protect themselves. The Radium Girls had none of this. Even more disturbing is that the USRC themselves distributed literature citing injurious effects from radium. USRC's head chemist, Dr. Edwin E. Lehman, even died in a fashion that likely relates to his exposure to radium. This lifted heads as others started to connect the dots between his death and similar deaths of the women workers. Similar work was done by over 4,000 workers contracted through different corporations in the USA and Canada. At USRC specifically, each painter had their own crucible to mix the paint and use camel hair brushes to apply the glowing paint onto the dials. Pay was about $3.75 per shift, which would come out to 250 dials per shift. This is equivalent to $92.04 in 2024. The USRC supervisors encouraged the workers to point the brushes with their lips as they would lose a fine tip shape after a few strokes. Without knowledge of the danger of the product, they even painted their nails, teeth, and faces for fun with it. Come 1927, over 50 of the workers that worked at the factory in Orange had died from radium poisoning. The clues trickled in far before the outburst into the public. Dentists noticed numerous problems with the dial painters, including dental pain, loose teeth, lesions, ulcers, as well as tooth extractions that refused to heal. The women also developed anemia, experienced oddly frequent bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw, now known as radium jaw. Additionally, their menstruation cycle and sterility was suppressed. Not everyone was convinced at first glance, as some believed that the x-rays received by the women to investigate the initial issues created the heavy hitter problems. Now we know that the amount of radiation absorbed via an x-ray is inconsequential compared to the intake from the radium dial factories. The women were referred to toxicologists that were contracted by the USRC. Columbia University specialist Frederick Flynn was one of the main referrals, but he lacked the medical training and licenses to properly treat or diagnose them. At least one of the examinations was a ruse and considered a disinformation campaign started by the USRC. The USRC denied claims that the effects of those suffering were linked to the radium. This was covered up by a multitude of doctors, dentists, and researchers who adhered to the USRC's request to not share their findings. In 1923, the first death struck. Her jaw was detaching from her skull prior to her death as well. Only a year later, 50 women were ill and a dozen had already died. The USRC was in need of assistance and contacted Cecil Kent Drinker and his wife, Catherine Rotan Drinker, from the Harvard School of Public Health to investigate the Orange, New Jersey factory in search of a reason for the ill employees. The drinkers soon discovered radium-contaminated dust covering the factory with no protective gear for the workers to handle it. Convinced that the exposure to the radium was the root of the health problems, he went head-to-head with the USRC. Arthur Roeder, the president of the company, fought back, shifting blame on infectious diseases outside of the factory. Under pressure from the USRC, medical professionals cited syphilis in a smear campaign, tarnishing the reputation of the girls. A direct quote from the company reads, "A great many people who were physically unfit to procure employment in other lines of industry." Drinker set out to publish his findings. It wasn't long before Roeder caught wind of Drinker's decision and threatened to sue. Drinker caved in. The USRC submitted Drinker's report to the New Jersey Department of Labor with altered results to curb any consequences. Drinker's colleague at Harvard, Alice Hamilton, learned of the false report. Eventually, this information circled back around to Drinker, who was aware that Roeder had acted in bad faith by submitting a falsified report. He pushed onward, regardless of the threat of lawsuit, and released a full, honest report on his own. The New Jersey Labor Commissioner demanded the proper safety precautions were set in place, which caused the factory to close up quickly. Dr. Sabin Arnold von Saucocki invented the radium dial paint several years prior to the events. His death came as a hammer onto a nail in November 1928, becoming the 16th official victim to radium dial paint poisoning. His death from the radioactive paint became a strong point of argument in favor of the Radium Girls in court. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Illinois in 1922, a new company was brewed named the Radium Dial Company. The idea of the job was the same: paint the dials with the radium paint. The dials painted in Ottawa would end up being used by Westclox Corporation's clocks and watches. These women shared the same lip, dip, and paint method as the USRC. Another unaffiliated plant in Waterbury, Connecticut also used the motto. They would go on to supply radial dials for the Waterbury Clock Company. Although completely different now, they are known as Timex. Joseph Kelly was terminated from the Radium Dial Company and created another firm in Ottawa called the Luminous Process Company. This was more of the same. 1926 and 1927 was the mark of the beginning for the effects, as radium poisoning had started to appear at the Radium Dial Company. The employees were completely unaware of the proceedings that were unfolding at the trials in New Jersey. The Radium Dial Company did authorize physicals among other tests to determine the toxicity of the paint, but never released the records to the employees directly. Camel hairbrushes were replaced by glass pens in an effort to move away from the needing to point the brushes. It took little time for the employees to realize that this was much less efficient. They resorted to the previous methods, as since they were paid by each dial, they relied on speed. Eventually, news did break of the New Jersey women. The company tried to deceive the employees by assuring them that the radium was safe and that the illnesses popping up in New Jersey were from viral infections. This went so far that a high-profile lecturer was sent to bring a calm to the brewing of nerves. At another point, Dr. von Saucocki, yes, the one who invented the paint then died from it, assured workers that the paint lacked hazardous ingredients and that it was so diluted that it could not harm their health. The workers returned to business as usual. Back in Orange, New Jersey, the story had become scooped up by the media quite heavily. Grace Fryer, one of the factory workers, took on the impossible. She pursued a lawsuit but struggled for 2 years to find a lawyer who wasn't scared off by the USRC. The first court appearance finally occurred in January 1928. 2 of the women meant to testify were bedridden to the point that they couldn't even raise their arm to take an oath. Fryer, along with Edna Hussman, Catherine Schwab, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice, are now synonymously known as the Radium Girls. By autumn of 1928, the USRC settled the case without admitting any wrongdoing. The company was also to cover all medical and legal expenses. None of the 5 women made it out of the 1930s alive. The employees in Ottawa seek compensation for dental and medical bills in 1927, but were turned down by management. The requests continued into the mid-1930s when finally the Illinois Industrial Commission, or IIC, were presented a lawsuit. By 1937, 5 women found Leonard Grossman who would represent them. He took the case free of charge. Spring of 1938 found the IIC ruling in favor of the women. The win was of little bearing, however, as the Radium Dial Company moved house to New York and the IIC wouldn't cross state lines to pursue the cash payout. All that was left for the women was a $10,000 deposit left by the Radium Dial Company when it was revealed that they didn't have insurance to cover any of the costs. The company tried to appeal the verdict, hoping it would get overturned, but the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to hear the appeal, sticking with the lower ruling's decision in 1939. Some of the women never received a payout. The Radium Girls are now a known landmark in health physics, women's rights, and labor rights. An individual's ability to sue a corporation for damages because of labor abuse was introduced and labor safety standards were created. This came to a roar in 1949 when Congress decreed compensation for all workers suffering from occupational diseases. Within the field of radium dial painting, new, proper safety precautions were implemented with the correct gear. Most notably, they no longer used their lips to point the brush or breathe in the paint. The final radium paint factory was shut down in 1978. In 1933, Robley D. Evans measured exhaled radon and radium excretions from a formal dial painter. He eventually was able to get reliable body content data from 27 X-painters as well. A few years later, in 1941, this information was used to set a tolerance level for radium. The Argonne National Laboratory hosted the Center for Human Radiobiology in 1968, which was mainly intended to provide examinations for the still remaining dial painters. They occasionally were able to collect tissue samples from them for future study. Collections from these survivors went on to be a leading contribution to a book on the effects of radium on humans.